Hi, guys, and welcome back to Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. In today's episode, I'm going to dive into a frequently asked question I get, and that is, how do you start a podcast? There's a lot to say about how to start a podcast. We're going to talk about the technical aspects, the planning aspects. So here is my basic 101 guide in how your business or you can start a podcast. Welcome to Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. I'm your host, Marley Freygang, and I'm here to help you filter out all the bullshit and become the next It Girl. This podcast explores the reality of what it really takes to make it out there. As it turns out, it is way less Instagrammable than I thought it was going to be. I'm still very much a work in progress, but there's simply nothing else I'd rather be doing than chasing my dreams. So let's learn from my mistakes and work together to achieve our dreams with more confidence, clarity, and direction. Let's get after it. So I have had Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl for going on 3 years. Soft launched the end of 2020, really strong launch 21, and I've been going ever since. Pretty much an episode every Tuesday. So here is how I got started and how I would and wouldn't maybe recommend you starting. Step 1, YouTube Academy. I live for YouTube Academy. You can find out anything you want to do in a podcast world from YouTube Academy. You're going to want to start out on YouTube looking at what is the gear you're going to need. Research the gear. What's right for your budget? What is right for your technical understanding? How much of a commitment are you going to want to go in? So that was the first thing I started searching for on YouTube Academy. This is 2020, like true 2020, even some in 2019, looking at the kind of mics I wanted to purchase. At the time, I purchased 2 blue snowballs. They are $60, or they were. They might have changed. They probably have a newer version. $60 USB only mics that go into the computer. So I bought those right off the bat, order them. It was $60, so $120 for both. Amazon. It wasn't a big investment. I wasn't sure how good or bad these mics are going to be. Actually, I think I was pretty naive in not knowing what quality these were. I was just like, these are a good starting price point. So I just went for it. I bought them. So that's the first thing I started learning from YouTube Academy. We'll get into upgrading your gear and figuring out what kind of software system is right for you as well. Okay, so then after I figured out what mics I wanted, I was like, wait, how actually do you upload a podcast? And it's this really cool thing that I have no understanding of the inner workings of, called an RSS feed. And you basically need to find a provider to host your RSS feed. It is so hard for me to say it. It's like an awkward word getting out there. Again, YouTube Academy. The choices are large in what kind of provider you can have to host your podcast. And I went through a bunch of different YouTube videos. I listened to different recommendations. I listened to different price points. And I ended up going with Buzzsprout. I am still RSS feed using and hosted by Buzzsprout. I love Buzzsprout. It has tiers of different levels of length they will host. It connects you to Apple, Spotify, all the majors, Google, iHeartRadio, podcast platforms that I haven't even heard of. It will help you connect it. I find the platform to be insanely user-friendly, and I think it is pretty simple. There's a million different options out of there for providers for hosting your podcast. It does take a little bit of time to get everything all set up. I remember when I was starting my podcast, having to fill out the bio and getting the photo and writing out the description. And then I don't remember if it's Apple or Spotify, you have to have an episode or 2 before they'll be accepted and whatnot. That's why people often release a trailer. Also a good way to start announcing your podcast. Again, I highly recommend turning to YouTube to help you successfully understand the steps of how to set up your hosting service and RSS feed to the brim. Again, I really like Buzzsprout. I think it's super friendly, super easy to understand. I believe the plan I'm on, and I fluctuate from their lowest plan to their middle plan, depending on how many minutes I have a month, is like $16 or $18. So it's pretty affordable. That's $16 or $18 a month. Again, the options are large. There's Anchor. I think there's even a way you can do it through Spotify on your own. I would take the time to examine different podcast hosting services. Type that into YouTube and like do pros and cons. Watch a few videos and you'll start to be able to see which one you think you will like without spending any money. So that is my second thing I would look into on YouTube Academy. Now let's talk a little bit more about gear because this is a mistake I made. I mentioned I got those 2 USB mics. They were really great because they were cheap. I wasn't super worried about damaging them. It was pretty simple. Basically, plug it into the mic, plug it into the computer, and you're good to go. I don't really recommend those because the sound quality was absolutely crap. And I didn't know that at first. And also at the time, I was just plugging in and recording straight into GarageBand. I had a lot of difficulty. Like I remember trying to like set it up for one of my first interviews and like I couldn't get GarageBand to work and like have 2. So this is another thing on YouTube Academy you should really learn. There is 2 different types of tracks you can have for recording audio. There is a combined, like this mic will be going and that mic will be going, but it's recording them both into one track, or a single track for the host and a single track for the guest. Depending on who your editor is, Eric, my editor, highly loves the 2 separate tracks. I agree because if I say or sneeze or cough or, talk over the guest, he can kind of edit that down on my side. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but these are the pros and cons of why there would be 2 tracks or one. One track is easier to edit if you're editing it yourself and, you're really just trying to get your fingers wet and figuring out podcasting. Maybe a single track is a way to go. At one point, I did have an editor who preferred the single track, probably because it was faster, it was easier to send than 2 tracks. But this is something else you're going to have to look at on YouTube Academy is how are you going to record? What are you going to record in? That was my mistake is I didn't think at all about the programs I was going to use. I didn't think about Audition, which is the Adobe way to record audio. I did use Adobe for a while. I don't think I actually ever straight recorded into it, but when I was still editing the podcast on my own, I edited in Audition because I had very small but light experience editing in Adobe Premiere, which again, everything I learned about editing pretty much came from YouTube. Like I would literally type in, how do I remove this clip? Or how do I move track over? Audition, like whatever. And that is really how I learned the bare bones of editing. Most Apples, I think all Apples come with GarageBand. It's a very simple, extremely basic, but yet you can still fuck it up program. And that is what I started with. Again, I highly recommend spending more time to look at the program you're going to edit and record into. Yeah, there's some hosting services as well that offer editing options. Buzzsprout, I don't think does. They offer a mastering option. They'll throw like kind of like a layer on it to make it sound better and more professional. But some hosting services will offer editing and whatnot. And we will get back to another really great program I highly recommend for those starting out podcasting. So something else at this point is you kind of want to think about budget. And this was something I did loosely in my brain, but if I was to do it again, I would set it up more with benchmarks. I bought these $60 mics, but I was very set on I'm going to release a podcast every Tuesday. Like I'm committed to this. I should have maybe had the wherewithal that after 2 months, I was going to stick with it. And if I made it to 2 months every Tuesday releasing a podcast, I can graduate myself and upgrade myself to higher quality gear. What ended up happening, which I completely regret, is I was very frustrated one day and I just went out and I spent a shitload of money that I didn't have at the time because I was like, I'm done with this. I don't recommend doing that because an influx like that in your bank account can really hurt. And I wasn't planning for it at all. It was just merely because I was fed up. So I would set up benchmarks for your budget for upgrading gear, upgrading software, adding maybe an editor or, someone to clip your podcast clips. Like, if I hit blah, blah, blah downloads, then I will get an editor. And I think that would have been a much better way to handle my budget and time and energy towards building out the podcast team, if you will. I kind of think we've covered everything from YouTube Academy. I still turn to YouTube to learn about maybe, how to get ads on podcasts. I'm always watching YouTube videos on the how-tos and what's going on in the world of podcasts. Here's the thing. Gear updates I want to say year, but maybe even every month, especially in this climate where there is so much podcasting going up. Gear is always changing. You're going to hit a place where you get some stuff you really like and it's working really good for you and you're going to have it for a while. And at some point, you're probably going to have to upgrade too. That's kind of the nature of the beast. This is something else I wish I knew about podcasting. I would not say professional, business-wise, hobbyist, podcasting is not a cheap sport. It is kind of expensive to get good quality sound, I have someone operating this camera, I've taken the time to spend the money in that way. And these are choices, but I just want you to be aware that these really professional podcast clips you see online take an investment and you have to be ready for that. Speaking of, probably one of the biggest at my time when I freaked out and bought all this gear is I use a Rode soundboard. For podcasters. This is the Podcaster Pro. This is the original. Now, I did buy this used, which I think was just fine. There's a newer version now. Having a soundboard and removing the sound from recording into my computer, huge game changer. It was so much easier to control the levels, to check the sound, to make sure both mics were recording and it wasn't just one and I was faint on their track or they were faint on mine. It's huge. I don't even use the Rodecaster Pro to the full extent of its ability. You can add sounds, you can do all these things. And you know what? I see a lot of people podcasting and I will see a Rodecaster Pro sitting in their shot. So I think it's a very easy soundboard. I think this one was about $500, but I highly recommend it. It was a great leveling up moment. While I'm on the topic of gear, because these are all the things you need to figure out way in advance of even sitting down to record your first real podcast or practice podcast. You have to take the time to play around and mess around with the gear. Do not book a guest or have your friend come over until you have completely figured out the system. I made that mistake. I thought I had figured it out. And then I had a guest here and she literally had to come back a different day because I couldn't figure out how to use the gear. Take the time to play around with it. Don't be under the bullet to figure it out because it is kind of stressful. I'm not the biggest gear girl and I had to YouTube Academy my way back into figuring out how to make all the things work. While we're on that note of allowing yourself extra time, it's the same for editing. You think, oh my God, I recorded it. It's done. It can come out on Tuesday. If you have never sat down and edited a podcast or even a film, anything like that, you're going to be shocked at the amount of time it takes me. I was very slow. I didn't know what I was doing. I had to stop every 5 seconds in the beginning to look something up on YouTube. If it was a 45-minute podcast, I think it would take me 4 to 6 hours because I didn't know what I was doing. And you have to be aware of not only is podcasting a little bit of a financial commitment, it is a time commitment and it's going to take that long. So be prepared, have all your gear set up and played with and practiced with. And then also you're going to want to take time to play and practice with your editing skills. So on that note, we're going to kind of shift a little bit to all right, so you have your gear and maybe you want to do this step actually before you get the gear, but the gear is what I get asked about the most. let's talk about the premise. What is your show going to be called? What is it about? When I started Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl, I had a really different idea of what I thought the show was going to be like. By the time I sat down to record the first episode, it had already changed. And now going into my third year, the premise has already changed kind of again. That is okay. However, there is more ways to set yourself up in a premise of a podcast show to make your show successful. And I want to mention this amazing program I took. It's called Grow the Show. If you are interested, please check them out. They also have a podcast called Grow the Show. I took this program and they talked a lot about your unique story premise, which is kind of the idea of having a really niche podcast. So for instance, this is used in the course, and I highly recommend you check out the course, is they talk about Hot Ones, just any other celebrity interviewing show. But what's kind of different? The fact that these people are stuffing themselves with super hot wings. So unique. That really stands out. Do you know how many, millennial women have podcasts or have a Joe Rogan style podcast? There's a lot of them. We are no longer in the era of pioneers of podcasting. So, I do think there is maybe some emphasis to find like, what's your niche or what's a little unique or different about your podcast that's going to make it stand out than the sea of podcasts that are out there. And you can learn so much more about setting yourself up to grow your show from the program, Grow Your Show, and the Grow Your Show podcast. If you sign up, please, 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 I would greatly appreciate if you mention that Marley Freygang from Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl sent you there. I would really appreciate that. All right, so now you've maybe got an idea of what your show is going to be about, co-host or single host. What's your style? So you kind of have to take some time to think about, is it going to be a really formal interview podcast? Anderson Cooper vibes. Like, are we going to be that formal? Or are you going to be like millennial Instagram girly? Definitely picking a tone of the kind of energy that you want to be sitting behind the mic with is super helpful. For instance, like I honestly chose a version of my personality that's a little bit more girly, a little bit more Instagram-y, a little more LA-ish than I am every second of my life, every single day. But I put that on a little bit for the podcast. So if you pick a style and tone that matches something in your personality, that can be helpful. But I don't think that's the case. If you want to sit down and be like, this is a very professional podcast and we're literally going to talk about the nitty gritty of finance and we're going to talk about it in the straightforward way, that is equally as valuable of a style and tone. Something else I want you to be thinking about when starting a podcast. This is not a quick growth thing all the time. Sometimes I've seen podcasts blow up overnight, but at the same time, you have to be able to be like, I'm going to sit my butt down behind that mic for every single week at minimum, I highly recommend, and speak on topics that I'm going to be interested for 10 years. Not something that, after 3 months, you're going to be so sick of asking people about. And yes, that can grow and evolve a little bit with changing your premise. I, have slightly changed it a little bit to more entrepreneurial than to like what's going on behind Instagram. And that's okay. But I could still sit behind this mic and talk about those two things probably for 10 years. I'm constantly fascinated by that. So you have to find something that really gets you going and that you want to learn about. Or if it's not as much a learning and growing show, it is more a teaching show. What are you an expert in that you can talk about for 10 whole years? Like I mentioned, another thing at this point you should definitely be thinking about is your target audience. What length of podcast episodes do they want to listen to? How long can you podcast for? Are you going to have a guest every week? So many things. This is what you really need to be thinking about when you're thinking about the structure of the show, as well as what does my schedule look like for recording episodes and releasing them? How often are you releasing? Some shows release every single day of the week. Other shows release Tuesday and Thursday. I'm on an every Tuesday thing, and that is more than enough for me. But what is yours going to be like? Also, the other things in order to get your podcast set up is we're going to talk about getting podcasty. We're talking about the cool music that you can get to go into your episode or trail into ads or, outro music. We're talking about cover art. And of course, then we're going to talk about recording. So sounds, there's a million different ways to get music. I mean, you do want to make sure you get something that doesn't have any copyrights or licensing problems. So, the Taylor Swift song is probably a no. However, the thing I have found to be the most fun is to hire somebody on Upwork or Fiverr and have them create a song for you. They know what they're making it for. You know what they're making it for. You can give notes, whatever. And the range that you can spend on your sound is as simple as like $15 to probably $1,000. So, I think there's a lot of budget-friendly options out there. I have had 2 different songs made for this podcast. They're both a little different. It's okay to evolve them. I wouldn't change them every year, but, once in a while, I think it's fine. And both of those have come from people I have hired on Fiverr. Cover art. Cover art, I actually, to be completely honest, another mistake I made when I started the podcast. Not something I took seriously at all. I was like, my friend even made the original cover art for Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. And I was like, yeah, perfect. That will go. I didn't have a photo of me. It didn't have that much color. It was just black, white, and pink. That was it. It said Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. Have fun with it. I do highly recommend that having your photo or at least a drawing of you does create a little bit more of, knowing them, a little bit more personality, a little more identification. So, you know what? Take the time to get your hair and makeup maybe done or do it up really nice, shoot with a professional photographer or shoot with a friend, but take the time to really think about what your cover photo is going to be like. My cover photo is pink and I'm wearing a black shirt and you can see me in the headphones. It's kind of a little repetitive that I'm in the headphones with the podcast mic. Hopefully, this is a podcast, but I think you get the vibe that this is a girly show and I'm kind of in the photo, kind of doinking on my head. Duh. I think that indicates a little bit about the tone. This is the very first thing a potential listener and a potential repeat listener, the most important person you want to get, is going to see. You really want to take the time to make sure that this cover art is something you are proud of and you are into and it communicates the tone and vibe about what this show is. I also think you should spend equally as much time about the name. My number one pet peeve, which I didn't do, but my number one pet peeve, I would not put the word podcast in your title. It's repetitive. We know this is a podcast. I don't think it should say Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl podcast. I think we're aware. I would skip it. And I also, I know a lot of people have platforms out there. I wouldn't include your name in the title. You can say by Marley Freygang or, dash Marley Freygang. But your name gets listed right under it. I don't think it's needed, in my opinion. Somebody could fight me on those, though. Whatever. At this point, you've got your gear. You know what you're doing a little bit. You've got a rough idea of how this is going to go. It's time to start practicing. I'm not kidding you. Record yourself. Practice with a friend or a partner. You are not a good interviewer. Let me tell you, I am not a good interviewer. And I listen back. I've thought about deleting them. I listen back to those original podcasts. Maybe they should be gone. You need to practice, just like anything, just like working out. You will get better the more you do it. The first time I tried to solo podcast, I wrote out a whole outline. I was so proud of myself. I was like, this shit is so witty, so good. I sat down to record at my computer because I was using the USB mics. 7 minutes. 7 fucking minutes. I'm a fast talker. You talk fast. Things are not as long as you think. You need to take the time to practice. And then on top of it, you need to take the time practicing interviewing a guest. and you will learn what kind of things are kind of dead end questions and what kind of things, maybe aren't the most comfortable to ask, but you should ask anyways. You will learn things about being on this side of the mic. I'm working on this actually currently. I do think I've gotten a lot better, is when a guest is speaking, not to go, yes, to not speak over them. Now I consciously try to just shake my head so they know I understand them and not speak because I'm talking over their track. Those are all things you cannot learn unless you do it. So you have to practice. Now you're going to have all these amazing solo pods that are not going to be as amazing as you think. And these practice interviews, it is definitely time to sit down and edit. You will also learn the things you shouldn't do in recording. I am a huge proponent of you should learn to edit your podcast. I would say on your own for at least 6 to 8 months, ideally a year, because you are going to learn so much about what wasn't interesting, what wasn't really clear speaking. And these are always things I could always go back and improve on as well. But if you don't take the time, to learn the amount of skill, effort, and energy that goes into editing, you're not going to understand why it takes, at least 24 hours for your editor to get the audio back to you. And you're also not going to understand what you're doing as a podcaster to be good or better. Or then you're going to listen to it when it's out and you're going to be like, oh, I wish I edited that out. Which brings me to something else I wanted to talk about is I do not edit my podcasts on my own anymore. However, when my editor, Eric, is done with the podcast edit, he uploads it to a thing called Descript. Descript is potentially the easiest editing software out there. It transcribes the whole thing. If you've never edited a day in your life, again, you can watch all their YouTube videos and learn how to edit it, but it transcribes it. You can literally edit out words or sentences, and it's transcribed right there. It can link their footage with it. It's honestly a super great system. If you are new to podcasting, I highly recommend checking out Descript as your recording in platform and editing platform. But my point being with all this getting podcasty talked is you're going to need to practice. Practice recording, practice editing, take time to think about your sounds and your cover up. And the last part is podcasting, as I mentioned, not a cheap sport. You might want help once you decide you want to take it seriously or it's a hobby you really enjoy. Build a team. So I have an editor, Eric, who also comes and say hi, Eric. Hi. Who also comes, brings these beautiful lights, beautiful cameras. He's also very good with sound. He'll check the sound on the mics. I build up my team to have him. Then Eric also is my editor. He'll take the program right from me, the video and audio, takes it and starts editing. If you hire an editor, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get them that material, all that things. And each one is really personal. I also have another girl who helps me a little bit with the social media, like the stories and, the photo shoots and a little bit of social media. I have a lot of help there as well. These are expenses, again, but I'm building up a team so I can keep doing it. And you know what? On some level, you have to have like a little bit of, this is a hobby thing to get it going. Like it's going to take some money and that's okay. So you can build up your team by getting editors, camera guys, lights guys, social media help. And I'm sure you can get assistants for booking and all these things. We can get into all that another day. But that's the other thing I wanted to leave you on the note of while you're starting your podcast. Batch your episodes. You want to get a catalog stored up. My goal for next year is to have 3 to 4 episodes uploaded and ready to go about a month in advance. So you don't want to be like, yet another mistake I made. It's Sunday night and I don't have a podcast episode for Tuesday. What the fuck am I going to do? You end up scrambling for a guest or scrambling to come up with an idea for it. Maybe you need your camera guy to come or you're doing it yourself. It's 2 a.m. There's no natural light. God knows what. you want to be as prepared as you can. So I would store up episodes, always have maybe an emergency episode on deck, something I wish I did. Currently, we actually do have one right now, but I'm not the favorite of it. Anyways, have an emergency episode in your pocket, but batch it up. Book out guests as much as you can in advance and have those stored up and ready to go. And lastly, my favorite yet least favorite note, because this will really show who's in it for the podcasting game and who just thought it was a quick way to rise to some social media fame. Stay consistent. Podcasting is not always a quick growth. God knows this show has not grown as quickly as maybe I thought it would at one point. It is sort of like a graph. You tell everybody you're starting a podcast, right away you have a huge spike up, and then it goes down. And less people are listening and not as many people listening. And then you're going to probably hit month 4 or 5, and it might go almost flat. This is when friends and family stop listening, your parents stop listening or posting about it on their Facebook. And you know what? The only thing you can do is keep putting out episodes. And I've hit that drop many different stages in this podcast. And then after a while, you start to slowly start growing this upward trajectory. It's not always fast and whatnot. So the only thing you can do to have any control over that is keep doing what you're doing, stay consistent, and release an episode. There's so much more I could talk about with starting a podcast. Maybe if this episode does well, I'll do a second episode about scheduling and scheduling apps and what to look for in your analytics and all those things. But, you can learn a lot about podcasting from YouTube Academy. Also, don't forget to check out Grow the Show. Please mention Marley Freygang and Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. Sincerely wish you the best luck in starting a podcast for yourself, your personal brand, or your business. And I hope this episode was helpful. Thank you so much for listening to Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the show. As always, we'll see you next Tuesday.